Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's panel, Not Just Housing, Artists Addressing the Housing Crisis. I am Mallory Roxana Nizam, and I am the Curator of Partnerships and Programming for Forward, which is a publication by Forecast Public Art. And we've got a great group of panelists here today, and we will be having a dynamic conversation about the intersection of housing, arts and culture, and the role that artists play in addressing this critical challenge. Next slide, please. So again, Forward is a publication of Forecast Public Art, which is a nonprofit organization based in the Twin Cities that activates, inspires, and advocates for public art that advances justice, health, and human dignity. Next slide. So a little bit about Forecast. Forecast works all across the country, based in the Twin Cities, and does a lot of local work, but also collaborates with partners all around the country and even internationally. Next slide. Next slide, please. Thank you. Forecast is a core team of staff and then a lot of different consultants that work with Forecast all around the country. A lot of artists, a very dynamic team. Next slide. Forecast does a lot of things. There's a consulting practice. It's a nonprofit practice. It re-grants. I'll just share a few of the things that Forecast does. There is a creative studio, which is where the organization expands access to tools, resources, and opportunities for artists. Next slide. In the organization's planning and engagement work, Forecast works with stakeholders and decision makers to create place-based public artworks that really center the mission of justice, health, and human dignity. Next slide. In the organization's Learning Institute, Forecast offers workshops and different trainings, both online and in person, really around this intersection of how artists are addressing the critical issues of our time in public space. Next slide. A new initiative called the Change Lab is working with communities to think through what the future of public art might look like and how we can make it more driven by justice. And that Change Lab has research fellows and is doing some policy advocacy work as well in 2023. Next slide. And then, of course, the Forward series, which is what is bringing us together today. It's a digital publication built off the legacy of Public Art Review, which for multiple decades was a print magazine focused on public art. Now we're really thinking about how are artists addressing the critical issues of our time. We know this has been happening for a long time, and we're just telling the stories of what's happening right now. And we're going issue by issue, focusing on what's really critical at the moment. And for this issue, we thought housing needed to be brought to the forefront. Next slide. And so to focus on housing, we called up our friend Paul Singh from NeighborWorks America, who is our moderator today. And we asked Paul to help us think about where this intersection is really happening and where artists are providing a lot of leadership for the housing sector. And this created our recent, just launched last week issue of, or 2 weeks ago, I guess by now, issue of Forward focused on housing. It's a beautiful issue. Next slide. We interview practitioners. We have a toolkit, and we have a special feature focused on public art projects that are happening right now that was curated by Jessica Mehta. And this is just a sample of what the case studies focus on: 3 critical areas: illuminating issues. So how are artists illuminating these issues, bringing them to light? How are artists helping us to imagine solutions and really move the needle on creating tangible change? And then how are artists really helping the housing sector to move towards a community-led practice of change? So those are the three focus areas that Paul helped to put together for this issue. Next slide. So today we're going to be inviting these panelists who are the faces, the beautiful faces that you're seeing right now. And they will be led by our moderator, Paul Singh, who is the Vice President of Community Initiatives for NeighborWorks America, where he leads support for comprehensive community development efforts that help to build vibrant local communities and provide equitable opportunities for people to thrive. And he, of course, was our guest editor for this issue. We worked really closely with Paul, and we thank him for all the great work he did on this issue. Next slide. Our next panelist is Dr. Lisa Yoon Lee, who is a cultural activist and the executive director of the National Public Housing Museum, also an associate professor at University of Illinois at Chicago, and is a professor of art history, gender and women's studies, and a teaching faculty member with the Prison and Neighborhood Art Project, and a member of the Chicago Torture Justice Memorials Project. And Lisa, along with her colleague Tiff, Beatty, these two were featured in the lead interview for Forward 5, which you can read in the issue. Next slide. Tiff Beatty was also featured in the lead interview for Forward 5 and is the National Public Housing Museum Program Director and was a 2019 Chicago United for Equity Fellow and received the Field Foundation's 2019 Field Leader Award. Tiff's also a spoken word artist, an MC, and an educator. Next slide. Our next speaker is Mark Valdez, who is also an artist, a cultural organizer, and a consultant, partnering with communities, organizations, civic institutions, using theater and creative tools to address community needs. In one of his recent projects was featured in the issue. It's called The Most Beautiful Home, Maybe. I'm sure he'll talk about it today. It's an interactive performance currently touring the country. And Mark was also recently appointed the artistic director of Mixed Blood Theater in Minneapolis. And last but definitely not least, Jennifer Lamb, who is the director of supportive services with the Southwest Minnesota Housing Partnership, which is a nonprofit community development organization that serves 30+ counties in Minnesota. And Jen's work is also featured in the issue. She participated in developing Prairie Homeless Companion, which is featured again in Forward 5 and performed in the first regional theater tour of that show, as well as the recording of the radio broadcast. So thank you all for being here. You can take the slides down, please. These are our panelists today. And I am
Great. Well, I think that's my cue. So good afternoon, everyone. Really pleased to be here with you and really looking forward to this conversation. I want to begin by just thanking Mallory for her collaboration on this edition of Forward, and it was a real pleasure to work with the entire Forecast team. And so thanks to everyone who contributed to the publication. As serving as the guest editor, I was just excited about the opportunity to learn more about partnerships that are succeeding in raising visibility and generating new approaches to address the critical housing crisis that we're all facing right now. So I was really impressed by all of the projects that we featured, and I'm looking forward to this opportunity to dive deeper with some of our all-star contributors here. Really enjoyed getting to know everybody's work through the essays and profiles, but this is actually our first opportunity to come together and discuss some of the themes. So I know this is going to be a really lively and dynamic panel. I have a few questions here that I'll use to help guide our conversation, but I encourage my fellow panelists here to jump in, build on one another's responses. I know that everybody has a lot to contribute on this topic. As we go along, I'll also encourage everyone in the audience to please drop your questions using the Q&A feature. So for example, if you want to know where Lisa got those fabulous glasses, drop that there and we'll save plenty of time at the end to respond to your prompts as well. So with that, I'm going to get the conversation rolling here and ask our first question to the panel, and would be great if everybody could take a chance to respond to this, which is just simply, what drew each of you to work at this intersection of art and housing? Why is this an important area for focus and collaboration? And Jen, would you mind getting us started here?
Sure, and I'll kind of answer this from two perspectives. First of all, the housing partnership where I work really began working in this intersection when they saw the opportunity to take place in the Art Place America Community Development Investment Program. We have a very rural region, and we'd seen a lot of really dramatic demographic change, not quite sure how we could interact with folks. We just knew that business as usual and in traditional development wasn't working. So really kind of utilize that as a means to start pushing ourselves out of our comfort zone and to reach the people we were serving in a different way. And so started exploring it that way. For me personally, my background's in social work, and some of the aspects I'm most passionate about with that include making sure people have their basic needs met, people helping them tell their story and advocate for themselves, build up their voice and their power, and then also helping them build relationship and community. And I see so many intersections of that with art. And so that really is part of the Partnership Art Initiative, is part of what brought me to the housing partnership to begin with, because I really just kind of saw that as this beautiful combination of all those things I was really interested in. So
that's great, and definitely using art as a way to raise voices of those impacted by critical housing issues was something that we saw across many of the projects in this edition of Forward. Anyone want to jump in and go next? Lisa, I see you're coming off mute.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be here with you. I just want to acknowledge that Tiff and I and the National Public Housing Museum is located on the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi nations. And I guess how I would answer your question about working at the intersection of housing and art would say that I really work at the intersection of public housing and public art. And those are actually different things. Historian Larry Vail has emphasized that the history of public housing is really not so much about housing, but our relationship to the idea of the public and a kind of shifting and troubled commitment that we have to the public sphere, a place of public goods that are available in a commonwealth, and there's a place that we can all make claims and thrive. And I really see our work at the museum as part of the democratic commitment to public housing and also public art as a basic necessity, not just sort of housing or art as a commodity. And then the last thing I would say is, I guess, because there's been so much public housing that has been dismantled in the last few decades, I really think it's important for us in a time of so much unmaking and destruction to be valuing artists who are the creators and the makers. And so we think a lot about how artists as makers and creators and people who help unleash our radical imaginations can help us address this history of dismantling and displacement.
Great, thanks, Lisa. Tiff, anything you would add there?
Yes, for sure. Thank you. Thanks everyone for being here. And what I would add, I think, to this conversation is, so my background is as a cultural worker and activist that has also been very engaged in doing poetry as a practice for myself to help my own sort of understanding evolve of, I think, the world and my place in it, as well as how poetry can possibly be a tool to strengthen communities. And so I think about, and I'm inspired by lots of different poets and traditions of cultural workers, but Audre Lorde is someone who early on in this sort of journey for me of thinking about poetry, that was something for me to thinking about something that it was really essential for all of us through reading an essay called Poetry is Not a Luxury. And I think we have, this sense as a museum that housing is a human right. And, in that same way, housing is not a luxury and it's not something that should be taken for granted. And so I really do see these things as interrelated, our foundations of who we are as people, of where we belong, where we feel safe, where we feel our voices can be heard, is really about who we are as a people, individually, and also as communities and as a society. So taking that, essay seriously, poetry is not a luxury. I've done a lot of different work trying to infuse poetry into some of my activism and trying to, build coalitions. But really this position at the National Public Housing Museum has been really my first professional role that I've been able to infuse art and culture into these conversations about creating a better society, creating more healthy civic dialogue, and bringing people together around that. So I do think that everything Lisa was saying about public housing and public art, it is essential, and it's really at the core of who I am, and I think who we are as an organization at the Public Housing Museum. I know we'll get into more specific details about that, but that's a little bit about me and my background.
Great, thanks, Tiff. And if folks are interested, I think we included some excerpts from some of the poems that inspired Tiff to get into this work, along with the interviews in this edition. So great. Mark, do you want to round us out? What drew you to work at this intersection?
Oh, sure. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to be on this panel with these amazing folks. Mark Valdez, he, him. I am on the ancestral land of the Anishinaabe and Dakota peoples here in Minneapolis. And I came to it out of a crisis of faith. It's very personal. I had been working as an artist at that intersection of social justice and theater making, and it just felt like it wasn't working. Like I was hoping that people would come see these plays and something would change, and then in time, the ripple effects of that would bring about community social justice transformation, and where we were in history in that moment, like it just wasn't. It was moving too slow. It didn't feel like enough, and I didn't know. Like I just was questioning. Like I'd been 25 years doing this kind of work, and to what like. I was feeling really defeated. And I had lived in Los Angeles at the time, and housing crisis there is whatever's beyond crisis, whatever's on the other side of emergency, like that's where the city is. It's the word hasn't been invented yet, but it's dire. And so I was just trying to think about like how to be useful as an artist, how to take the tools and the work that I've been doing as an artist, and if I was looking for change and policy shifts, then how do you bake it into the work itself so that you don't leave it up to chance that somebody will be moved and maybe will talk to somebody or do something, but how do you embed it into the work itself so that the work itself is really clear in moving that change forward. So it started off as an experiment, and it worked, or it's working. So here I am on this new defined path.
That's great. Thanks, Mark, for sharing that personal story. And I was really inspired by some of the tangible change that some of the projects that we featured, including yours, in the publication, that they were able to achieve. And I think we'll talk a little bit more about those results as we go along here. But shifting gears, in their piece, Tiff and Lisa quoted the artist and activist Tony Cade Bambara's phrase that the role of the artist is to make the revolution irresistible. I thought that was a real nice and perhaps provocative quote. So was curious, what does that mean for each of you, and how did you witness or feel that as part of the projects that we highlighted in this publication? And anyone who wants to start can.
I'm happy to go first and then turn it over to Tiff. I mean, we love, along with Audre Lorde, Tony Cade Bambara. And for those of you out there who have not read her work, for example, The Salt Eaters, it's so beautiful about care and caring and sort of the perils of social activism also. So I just want to give a shout out to that amazing work. I think, in this work that we do, there's a lot of struggle, there's a lot of pain, there's a lot of truth and speaking truth to power. But I think we also really believe that you can't just articulate what we're against. you have to also articulate what you are for. And that means sort of really thinking positively, unleashing our imaginations, and envisioning a future that we all want to be a part of, which means that I think you have to use beauty, you have to use sort of all the tools that we have in our toolbox to actually bring people along on this journey. And, the history of public housing is really ugly also, because it's a history of white supremacy, of racism, of injustice in our nation. And the thing is, that's not the only story of public housing. So, for example, in the work that we do through our oral history archive and gathering the stories and amplifying the voices of public housing residents themselves, there's so much beauty, so much care, collective joy, so much wonder, sort of resilience and friendships, bridge clubs and book clubs. And all of these stories, I think we want to remind ourselves that these stories of joy are actually the thing which is going to make this collective struggle for housing as a human right something that everybody is going to want to get on board with. But I'll turn it over to Tiff, who's doing the work.
Yeah, I think the only thing I can really add to that is an example, which is one of the main projects that we talked about in the issue, which is called Inequity for Sale. It also included a podcast series called Legally Stolen. So there are a couple different elements of the project, but primarily it was an artist by the name of Tanika Lewis Johnson, who had this brilliant idea to visualize inequity in her community and also its connection to larger issues of housing discrimination, particularly here in Chicago, but these are policies that were supported at the federal level and things that happened all over the country through practice of land sale contracts during the period of the 50s and 60s, when redlining, as well as racial covenants and all kinds of things that we have maybe even taught in school, maybe not. So these are things that are very, to a lot of people, invisible. So just in simply visibilizing this history through installing these landmarkers was one step. But the next step was what Lisa was saying, was making them beautiful. Like, she worked with designers who thought really a lot about, not only having something that people could access, but also could be curious by. So they're yellow, they sort of look like a caution sign, and they really disrupt, but also fit into the environment that they're installed, which is on a city, block. And so it's a sign that you may see, something similar, but it's taking that and kind of flipping that visual for folks and then drawing you in as well with powerful language, speaking to this history. So directly distilling a very complicated history of racist discrimination through contracts into a one sentence, sentence about this, what happened at this site. So, speaking to the conversation about memorials and monuments, but taking a step further and giving folks also additional information and getting an invitation to get involved. So folks in the community who are presently impacted by this history were invited to share their stories as well, to contribute to the project. These were incorporated into the podcast. So, through Tanika's work, which is social practice, is not about just installing a landmarker, but really starting a conversation, inviting people into that conversation and making bold statements and inviting people to respond to those and interact. So one of the bold statements that was shared as a part of this was that it called this practice a crime, which we know that it was technically legal. So just calling this out as a crime against humanity, regardless of what the law may say. This is something that was criminal, to take advantage of folks, to be deceptive in this way, to literally steal wealth from entire communities and populations through these practices. And then the second part of that is that reparations are due. And so saying that clearly on the sign is more than just, making something that folks can look at and say, oh, that's cute, but really demanding folks to feel a way, right? Whether you support reparations and you agree and you want to, support that cause, or you have a visceral reaction that tells you, I don't know, I might have to look more into that. So it immediately requires a response. And whether folks get involved directly or whether they have conversations with their family members and their neighbors, I think that's part of what makes the work that the artists do that we work with so powerful, is that it demands a conversation and demands community to come together and to find solutions and to consider what the artists are proposing as solutions.
That's great. Thanks, Tiff. Appreciate what you're sharing there about how you spark curiosity and conversation, especially among people who may not be directly impacted by some of these issues. I thought that was one of the outcomes in a few of the profiles that we featured. Jen or Mark, anything you would add?
I would just, Tiff, you used a couple of words that really kind of echoed with me and that I've been thinking about as I reflected on this quote. One of those was just that idea of making the invisible visible. That was part of our challenge with Prairie Homeless Companion, is in these rural communities, there's challenges and issues there that people aren't aware of because they haven't lived it themselves. They don't know somebody who's experienced it, and it's just not visible. Because it doesn't play out the way we think it should in another context. So they're not, we get so focused, we've got those blinders on and we're not seeing what's around us. And so I think working with artists, particularly on this project, gave us, both within my organization, with some of our partners and folks that came and saw our show, it gave us a different lens to look at that issue through. And to look at our communities and our neighbors through, and speaking with some people afterwards, just even within the community who had seen the show, people were more interested and wanting to reach out and figure out what could they do, because they had no idea that there were people living in storage units just down the street from where they might live, or that there was, they didn't see somebody sitting on a street corner asking for help, and we don't have shelters in the traditional sense. So they just, community members and people that had come to the show didn't even realize that homelessness existed because they didn't see it. So it was just really eye-opening, I think, for them to become aware of that through that medium, and had those community groups and members really kind of talking about, well, what can we do? How can we support some sort of initiative in this way? So.
I would just add really quickly that I think there's something really powerful about beauty, right, and beautiful future. Our pop culture is littered with dystopia, with dystopian futures, and we can only imagine what we know. And if what we know or what we've been shown is this future where everything is terrible and everything is just gone to hell, then there's little incentive to or ability to actually imagine something that is positive and beautiful and bright and fun and healthy and just. And so I think, one of the things that we're trying to do is just create that space, just imagine that beautiful future and just invite people to think, what does it look like? Can you see, a house cleaner keeper living next to a lawyer? And can you see that we have veterans housed? Can you see that seniors have supportive care? And so just inviting folks to do that in a fun, joyful way that lets you acknowledge feelings and discomforts, but that also lets you kind of, in that moment of discomfort, kind of get dislodged and move to the kind of places that we want to move to. I think collectively, as a society, I think these are things that we want, we desire, and I think that framework of irresistible, I think, is just so right on.
Yeah, can I just also chime in? I love the way that Mark was talking about that, because it's also not like we have an idea of what is beautiful and we're sort of putting it out there and we're going to be gatekeepers. So much of how we judge what is beautiful is linked to how we judge what is good and true and how we understand what is just in a society. And so a lot of what we do at the museum is thinking about how do we create opportunities for everyone to determine what is beautiful for themselves and their communities. And this kind of right for all of us to determine that is a kind of cultural right, and it's part of cultural equity. And it's like, that's so much, which is also at the sort of intersection of housing and art, because it's the right for people to have self-determination and how they live their lives, you know, as well.
Great, thanks, Lisa. Jen, would love to circle back and maybe go a little bit deeper on the example you were just sharing. Could you talk a little bit more about some of the partnerships that came together as a result of a Prairie Homeless Companion, and talk a little bit about what those cross-sector partnerships brought about? What was the result from those different types of partners engaging?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, just a little bit of background as to how Prairie Homeless Companion even came about to start with. As the housing partnership was doing work on kind of this area of creative placemaking and arts and culture and community development, we had worked within a small community, about 400 people. Half of them were Micronesian, half of them were Norwegian. And I had done a lot of work within that community and worked with one particular artist named Ashley Hansen, who we really developed a great relationship with as an organization. She ended up coming to us and working as our resident artist for some time, and tried to really kind of bring the rest of the organization on board with how arts and culture could really be used. And so brought in a variety of artists that we could meet with to see how different mediums and practices were being used to do social justice and to do housing related work. And one group of artists that she brought in was Zamia Theater Project, a theater company out of the Twin Cities made up of professional theater artists as well as actors with lived experience of homelessness. And all of the shows that they do are really focused on this idea of homelessness and making people in the Twin Cities area aware of some of the nuances around that and some of the struggles and the challenges that people might not think about beyond not having a roof over their head. You know, the struggles with how the criminal justice system can play into that, and just how hard it can be to break that cycle and everything. So they'd come, they did a show for us, and we were having this really great share back time afterwards. And I posed a question or made a comment about kind of the difference between urban versus rural homelessness. And we began discussing that further and found out that their artistic director, Marin, had been toying around with this idea of Prairie Homeless Companion as a concept for a show. And so really, in collaboration with Zamia, our organization, and Ashley, we were able to really start to put this into development. We were able to use their resources and skills. They were able to use our networks to really speak to the people within our region, service providers, people with lived experience of housing instability, and really kind of find some of those nuances and those stories as to what those differences in homelessness between that urban and rural look like. In that work, we also had the opportunities to connect with some folks on a really short-term basis. As we did each show, we brought in artists within each community we performed in, bringing in musicians, actors, again, more folks with lived experience who wanted to come and personally share their story of housing instability through, a poem or a story that they told. So, I guess with those collaborations, we were just really able to utilize those resources, those networks, other relationships and partnerships that everybody at that table had, and create something that, drawing on all those strengths, create something that no individual agency, group, or artist that was part of that could have done on their own. It was a rich story full of nuance and humor, poignancy, and each partner in that project brought a different perspective that really kind of helped mesh it all together and made that project what it was. So
Yeah, great. Thanks, Jen. And Mark, maybe building on that, and maybe building as well on the response you gave to the last question, could you talk about maybe a particular memory where an artist, a culture bearer's work at this intersection with housing really moved you, or maybe moved someone else? This could be maybe something that you have experienced, or maybe something that resulted from your work on the Most Beautiful Home, maybe.
Yeah, I think a lot about the work that John Malpede and Henriette are doing at LAPD, the Los Angeles Poverty Department. They're working in Skid Row, in Los Angeles, Skid Row. They've been doing this work for, going on 20 years, if not longer. And there's something so joyous about the work that they do. They involve the residents of Skid Row it's their stories, it's their performing, and it is epic. Something I saw recently was a parade through Skid Row, marking kind of lifting up heroes and significant cultural workers, activists in the area, and going to these different spots throughout the community. There was a second line band leading the way. There was food, and it was joyous. It was just this moment of light and fun. And I think as we were making Most Beautiful Home, that's the sort of spirit that we were looking for. It's like how in that space of love, in that space of joy, how do we have these conversations about who gets to decide who lives in our communities and doesn't, and what kind of futures do we want? What are our values around home and housing, and that combination of those things side by side felt theatrical and interesting, and like there's the potential to shift, to kind of move the needle. I'll just end with one little anecdote. During the show, we did this show in Mesa, Arizona, and there's a moment where the audience plays a board game together. And in that particular performance, we had Spanish interpreters. There's a group of Spanish-speaking business owners. And in one group, there was the mayor of Mesa, a 12-year-old young woman, two Spanish-speaking businessmen, and somebody who's with an anti-affordable housing group, all in one little group having this conversation. And it was like perfect. It was just like, that. How do we do this in every day? Like, how do we get this group of people talking to each other about housing and policies and beautiful futures and what we want and path forwards? And it was just beautiful. It was wonderful. So
that's great. I really like in that example, kind of, a new way of opening a conversation and building connections where they wouldn't otherwise exist. And I think that's something that we saw across several of the examples that were featured in this edition. So Lisa, Tiff, I'm going to turn to you next and just ask, where are you seeing opportunity areas or openings in these types of collaborations? Are there specific policies, practices, movements that you're leaning into right now because of you're seeing these types of opportunities?
Yeah. Well, Paul, as social activists working for social change, we are perpetual optimists. The glass is never half empty. It's not even half full. It's always overflowing, And housing is an issue that everyone is really viscerally feeling and seeing every day in their daily lives as an issue of one of the utmost importance. So that's sort of one thing. And just like Jen and Mark both mentioned, we're sort of moving out of our silos, gently but insistently, in making connections between, for example, issues of homelessness and public housing and affordable housing, which sometimes are really separate, different movements, and sort of doing work to bring those movements together, and also really drawing on the learnings of other movements, like looking to Indigenous communities and the work for land back and reimagining our relationship to the land as not a commodity, but how do we actually live in consort and also think about different structures like land trusts. Also, the environmental justice movement, I think, has been incredible for conversations around housing, thinking about smaller footprints. And reimagining the materials that we can and should be using in order to make our lives safe for future generations, as well as for ourselves. And the other thing I will say is, like thinking about really broad scale movements like abolition, even though we now say Breonna Taylor's name, since 2015, more than 250 women have been killed in their homes by police officers. So thinking about the connection and conversations around abolition and a vision of restructured society in a world where we have everything we need: food, shelter, education, health, art, beauty, clean water, and more. Like, these are all foundational to our personal and community safety. So I see those kinds of partnerships and opportunities as great. And then the last thing I would say is, as a history museum, we really believe that we have so much to learn from history. Have to go upstream, ask what we not yet learned and how can it inform our futures. And so we're really into research art, like artists who are thinking about research and incorporating it into their making. That's something that Tanika has done, that we've done public programs with Shauna Griffith, an artist from New Orleans, who is also an amazing research artist, and also our new artist as instigator, Marisa Moran-Yan, who's also a research-based artist. And we should understand the history of zoning in America and how it's been deployed and used against people of color. And so then what does that mean for today if we're reimagining zoning laws that could actually be deployed for justice, right? And so we're really thinking a lot about all of these histories, how to bring them out to the public. And yeah, these are all great opportunities and things that we're working on now.
Yeah. It's so funny because we haven't even talked about this, but I was recently just invited. I haven't even had the conversation yet, but to join a committee about zoning, which is just wild to me, that because I would never have invited myself to that. But I think it's relevant, right? That folks see our work as intersecting with those conversations. And that's encouraging to me every time I'm invited into a room where I feel a little bit like an outsider, right? Like, that's an opportunity to bring these intersections together with folks who have expertise. So thanks for reminding me about that. And yeah, in terms of, I think there's a lot that Lisa said, and I won't add too much to it, but I'll just agree and say that I've also seen this from my perspective in looking at opportunities to collaborate with folks and how they see our institution as a unique institution, in the sense that we are committed to history and we're equally committed to the contemporary moment and also imagining the future. And so just being able to explore these things and not feeling like we have to stay in one sphere or one box, but being open to that housing is also about health, and it's about education, and it's about all of these public goods. I was actually facilitating a story circle this weekend with a bunch of equity fellows, and we were talking, we started out talking about housing and we ended up talking about schools. And so it's just one of those things that you see when you allow people to tell their stories, that the intersections emerge, and that it's actually counterproductive to try to silo these conversations, to say that housing is over here and education is over here and incarceration is over here. And so it's actually something that we do naturally as humans, is make these connections and draw these together. So in some ways, artists help us create these spaces to do the work that needs to be done. And I think one thing that I will also raise is, in addition to health and in this moment of still being in the pandemic, that's something I think folks have become hyper aware of, is the intersection between housing and health, as well as the movement for racial justice and having a real moment. Some people are committed, some folks are, obviously taking advantage of the moment, but I think there is seriously, especially when we're thinking about connecting intergenerational groups. So, older folks that remember sort of the pre-Reagan years and younger people who are imagining, a Green New Deal and what that would do for our country. So really linking groups with different expertise as well as different perspectives where they are, whether that's age, race, or class. I think there's a lot of opportunities for also connecting this to movements like reparations, to think about housing as a part of these larger conversations, whether it be about labor rights, and just the cost of living, inflation that we're all dealing with right now. So just really bringing people together to work through some of these issues and also learn from history and the research that's out there is something that's really exciting to me. And I do think that there's a lot of energy for it right now, particularly in this moment.
Great. Well, I see we have some questions coming in, and I'm going to turn there shortly. And maybe this is a good moment just to remind folks that if you have any questions, please queue those up now, and we'll pose them to our panelists in a moment. But I'll ask one final question before doing that, and maybe we can keep our responses somewhat brief to allow time for the Q&A. But one of the things I was really encouraged by this topic, creating safe, decent, affordable housing, it seems really intractable. But in many of these, the case studies, the profiles we featured, there was actually change, that folks were able to come together around some new or innovative solution. So we'd just be curious to have each of you comment, sort of what change have you seen? What tangible change have you been encouraged by? And sort of what change would you hope to see going forward as well?
I'll hop in here really quick. So when it comes to tangible change, we don't have an end product beyond a play and a radio show that is any sort of change, but audience surveys really kind of indicated, a better understanding of that homelessness. Housing groups in the region were talking about it, inviting me to come and kind of engage in that conversation. And then COVID hit. And so some of that changed a little bit at that point in time, and maybe some of those groups fell off. But what I'm really excited about is that the show is being rebooted this summer and going to be touring in another part of Greater Men. And, so I'm hoping that those conversations can get re-engaged and that we can get more partners, some of our legislators and other folks there at the table, so that those conversations can continue to grow and become more robust and kind of continue to do that work, and that just bringing awareness to the issue can be happening again.
Anyone else changes that you've seen? Yeah, go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, we've saw the adoption and the kind of increased interest in art-based approaches, within the kind of with advocates, but also government workers. One of the challenges that we had was just being able to connect with government workers. But in the instances where we did, the folks got really excited, and we've been in contact with them, sharing tools, sharing methods, so that they can do their version of this work and try to incorporate that into what they're doing. So, I think the biggest success right now is just people are starting to see, to Tiff's point, like the artists have something to contribute to this conversation, that that the resources that we bring, the insights that we bring, the way that we can make meaning, kind of build consensus, kind of reflect back, like these are things that we do kind of as part of our practice and have benefit in kind of other spheres. So that's been really good. And policy just moves at a different pace than production. So I think the true test is just really is what we're doing influencing policy, and I think that's something that we'll keep an eye out and kind of keep at it.
Yeah, I'll just add that I feel like people really understand that the world that we have now, as it is given to us, is not the way that it has to be, and that there are social forces working really hard. Like capitalism is working on overdrive for inequity and for injustice. And there's just like so many amazing movements that are fighting and struggling against this and doing it with joy, with vision, and that we are starting to also realize that the people who have been most marginalized, whether it's people who are living with disabilities, people of color, they actually have so much to teach us about how we can and should be moving forward. So I really feel like a lot of the contemporary movements are really sort of transforming and starting to listen more and organize with in solidarity with people. And the last thing I'll say is that, I mean, we believe our theory of change is that you have to have narrative shift, and that the shortest distance between two people is really a story. And so that this kind of like giving of accounts is linked to civic engagement and holding one another accountable, and like linked etymologically. And this is all also linked to like fiscal accounting and reparations and remediation. And so sort of repairing this harm. And so I really am heartened that I think people are starting to see that. And then I think the work that we're doing is actually changing and shifting the narratives around housing in this nation. And not just us, but like you all, like everyone out there doing this work. Yeah.
Thanks, Lisa. I'm going to segue us into the Q&A because I see there's some really great questions here. And Tiff, I'm going to give you the first crack at the response here. So I'm going to combine a couple of questions that have come in. One of the attendees points out that housing can be a political football at times. And so curious if any of the panelists could talk about how art has helped or could help bridge some of the political divides, or I'd expand that out, other divides that we may be experiencing right now. And a second question around what role and how can the cultural community help to strengthen civil society, which I think is somewhat linked to that first question as well. So yeah. Tiff, I'll give you the first crack at it if you want.
Yeah. I mean, I have to go also back to that example that I gave about the story circle, right? Where people weren't necessarily arguing their opinion in a story circle, right? They're just telling their stories. And in a lot of ways, art is someone telling a story from a perspective, inviting other people to respond to that, to add their own stories, to really try to understand this situation that we're all in called life, or capitalism, or whatever it is that we are, is the frame. And so I think in a lot of ways, art allows us to just get back to our humanity and sort of shed some of those identities that do divide us, or if we're not shedding them, at least becoming critical, to have sort of that scrutiny, light shined on the way that we've come to believe what we believe, without, some of the pressure of, for example, like a town hall where we're struggling over a particular issue that has, particular consequences for communities. And so it's a sort of a leveling ground in a lot of ways, to bring people together. But I also think folks can be changed by the information that is shared through art, in a way that maybe they're not expecting to. Like the example about Tanika's project, I think, one of the outcomes, which I was also thinking about with your last question, was that, this research that Tanika built her project on has been out there since like around 2018, 2019. But it didn't really have the same impact as a report that it had as an art project. As an art project, it was able to get attention from certain folks who sit in political seats, who, may not have considered this their issue because it's something that happened in history. But what Tanika revealed as a part of her project was that the city of Chicago today owns properties that were sold on land sale contracts. So that in a lot of ways is breaking down the sort of myth that this is all history, right? That it's actually something that's happening right now that, can be something that politicians and everyday people can advocate for repair, to happen, sort of regardless of what side of the political spectrum you might be on. This is something that is illuminating the consequences and a direct reality that folks are facing today. So breaking down some of those barriers and those myths and bringing people together around forensic truths, facts of what happened and who was impacted, as well as creating a place for people to tell their stories and to create repair in this moment.
Thank you, Tiff. Anyone else want to chime in there? How, in your experience, art has helped to kind of overcome divides or strengthen civil society?
I think like in the work that we were doing, so my co-creator, Ashley Sparks, I'll have to just credit her because she's so responsible for a lot of the joy that is in the piece that we created, The Most Beautiful Home. And so, and one of the things that was important, that we felt was that these moments where the audience could talk to each other, that, like there's so much around, because we're talking about housing that we're never taught. Like you don't get this at any level. Like your experience with housing is that you pay rent or you pay your mortgage if you're lucky, but that's kind of, we don't know about types of housing. We don't know about histories of housing. We don't. This is not part of our civic education. And so, so part of what we want to do was to create some of that space where audience members could talk to each other around their beliefs around housing, their priorities around policies, a sense of what the values are around housing, and that and to create a space where strangers can just practice getting these words out and having these conversations, and that if you can do it in the confines of a play, which is like frankly low stakes, right? It's like we're doing a play, like but you practice dialogue, you practice listening, you practice sharing these ideas, thinking about these ideas. At one point in the show, we asked people to share their homes, their history of the story of home, of their family histories. And it was remarkable how we crafted this performance that by the end, where we asked this question, it got really deep and really personal, and there's there's something connective here, and there's something just powerful about being able to come together and learn, and there was definitely like difference, absolutely, and in the confines of the space, we could talk about kind of what we cared about and what we wanted and what we hoped for, and it felt like more of that. Like, how do we do more of that?
That's excellent. I know our time is rapidly dwindling here. There was another question, which I think we have talked about, which is sort of how we see art creating change at the policy level. We had some discussion around the zoning, for example, and what some possibilities might be to approach that. I will say too, funding is often a major barrier here when it comes to creating additional affordable housing. There is a great another example in the publication from New York City, where some tenants came together and through art and performance were able to advocate for some additional financial resources to support the renovation of public housing. So would encourage folks to check that out if you haven't. But anything, a closing thought or two on just kind of how we can, how art can contribute to change at the policy level? Any thoughts from our panel?
I will just kind of, one of the things that we do in our show is that we provide real world examples of what people are doing to change the systems and all. So we toured the show locally, and I think one of the things that we realize is like sometimes, we'll ask like what kind of change do you want to make, and folks don't know what that looks like. It feels overwhelming, it feels daunting, it feels insurmountable, and so what we try to do is just lift up local work, local people doing change work, and provide. We hear from them in their own words. So it's a video moment. There's contact information so you can connect with them. But it was like these super, just like they're short and specific examples about what's already happening that you may not already know of, often related to kind of policy shifts.
That's great. I think it speaks to expanding the sense of what's possible. I think that's great. Thanks, Mark.
Yeah.
Well, unfortunately, we are out of time here. As you can tell, we could have gone another hour with this conversation. Please join me in thanking our panelists. And I'm going to turn it over to Mallory for a couple of closing words.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, everyone. I could have done another hour of that. So thanks for that jam-packed, beautiful hour of conversation. Everyone should go read the publication now, dig in a bit more to some of the projects folks referenced. You will get a video recording link so you can share it out with folks or rewatch it. We thank you all for attending today. Panelists, appreciate you. And everyone be well. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.